First of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Isola, for hosting us as well. So my name is Himanshu Arti, and with me, my colleagues and co-founders, Kiri Miley and Janani Mohan are also here. So we have a company called Ananas. Ananas is an ecological design company. We're based out of Bangalore. Simply put, we design living systems. So we also regenerate landscapes and revitalize communities by this method called permaculture. So permaculture is largely our tool that we use. So I'll just quickly give you a brief on what's going to happen in this presentation. First, we're going to talk about what is permaculture. Then we take you through a bit of our design process. We'll show you some of our projects that we've done, and the last 15 minutes are reserved for Q&As. So basically, permaculture is an ethics-based design systems methodology for the creation of regenerative human habitats. Now, this is our definition. Essentially, what we do is through permaculture, we create self-sustainable human habitats in terms of self-sustainability, in terms of its own water, its own food, and also to sort of live regeneratively. So we use this largely as our, it's largely our toolbox, and most of our designs that we do is through permaculture. A lot of it is what we call as regenerative design. This means we're going beyond sustainability and being regenerative, which is not only restoring the landscapes and region and also creating a better space, but we're also giving something back to the nature and to the environment that we do. Like, think of it as a small example of a degenerative system is like you go to a market and you buy a soap, which is probably made with chemicals and so on. Then you think about a sustainable system, which is that you go to a market and buy an organic soap. A regenerative system is where you go and you plant a soap nut tree, and then you take the fruit from it and then you use it. So you're not only consuming it, you're also giving back to the nature. So that's kind of what we apply in our design as well. So the aim is to find ways to provide for our basic human needs, and also building resilience while we are providing for human needs for water, soil, food, and livelihoods. The process is, we go through a vision with a questionnaire with the client, and then we do a thorough environmental study. We do elements linkages to zoning. And then comes the design, and after that, implementation guidance. So to take you through the process, Janani is going to explain about a bit of our process.
Yeah. So after the phone call with the client, we get an insight into what their big dreams are. After which we send this questionnaire so that it's a more structured form of thinking about what their immediate short-term needs are, what are the longer goals, as well as some more details about the site, like the history of the site, any problems that they have faced, etc., will be covered in this questionnaire. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so after the questionnaire, we first do this document called an environmental study. This is basically a compilation of all of the preliminary research about that particular bioregion that the site belongs to, as well as all our observations from our first few site visits, the physical features of the site, as well as the energies that move in and out of the site. So what is the purpose of this environmental study is that the client is equipped with a document that has in-depth knowledge about the site, and it is something that even the community members and anyone else working on the site can use to make more informed choices of their designs for the future. Right. So in that we have like a brief of the site, we put in the survey map that the client gets done, and then we have climatic data. This is our secondary data. We find the closest weather station, and we get like the wind data, solar temperature, the rainfall. We also go into the detail with the rainfall because that's important for us with the rainwater harvesting capacity and everything. We look at the weather patterns for over a decade or more so that we are designing for catastrophe, right? So because we're shaping the land with large water structures, and so we need to be aware of the least amount of rainfall and the highest amount of rainfall the site has received in a day or over a year. And winds become a very important thing for us as well, because winds reduce the amount of reduce the loss of water, whether it is from storage to evaporation or it's from the plants through evapotranspiration. So we try and understand the wind. Sometimes the land might be very unique, so it is important to go find out these patterns from the locals around there. It might, the weather patterns might have, the site might have its own local weather patterns. So combining the two of them, we have all our climatic data to help us to prepare. Then we go into topography, some of the features of the land. Where are the bunds? Is it very rocky? What does the soil look like? And then the vegetation. Vegetation we put into different zones based on what it is looking like. And if it is very sparse, which is often how it is, we try and get into the factors of what might be causing this, degradation of land, which might be grazing or it might be fire. Really understand the problems that the land is facing. And another thing that we do is, so if the client wants more information about their existing vegetation, we go and make a plant list where we have like the ecological significance of that particular plant. Otherwise, we skip that. We go to the nearest reserve forest to understand what forest type it is. Because more often than not, you see that in most of the mood boards and these inspiration boards, there are photos of some very dense, tropical or temperate, like Bali kind of gardens. And that's very impractical for something that might be a scrub jungle, like a Hosur district or a Krishnagiri district. So it's important to set expectations for the client, what to expect, what kind of a bioregion you're in. And then we touch upon the fauna a little bit, where whether it is to see what we're dealing with, whether it is in terms of pests, or it's to provide shelter for some endemic creatures that are very important to that ecosystem, like birds and butterflies. Then we go ahead and give them a list of fauna that is found around there, and any host plants or features to attract and shelter them. If we're dealing with bigger guys like elephants, then we have different strategies to deal with them. But these are all to just reduce conflict, and nothing is a foolproof method of avoiding any encounter. Then we go into soil. We have some basic field tests that one can do without having to take a sample for testing in a center. These field tests will give us a basic understanding of how much organic matter, which is humus, is there in the soil, which is what determines the fertility. See if it's very clean, and based on that, we can place it as good for the pond, or this soil is better for planting. This is too rocky. We sort of like understand the soil we're dealing with there. Then we have sectors and flows, like I mentioned, the different energies that are flowing into site, so that we can tap into these energies and we can manage them better. Here we have the sun, winds, fire, wildlife, and these are all marked with arcs. So what we essentially do is we take the base map of the land, right, the survey map, we take a printout of it, and then we overlay all of these studies done on tracing paper. So there's a series of tracing papers overlaid with these different studies, which will then help us place these elements based on, looking at the patterns and, feeding off what is existing and working for the land. We are able to then sensibly design for that landscape. So water flow is also a sector, is also a flow, but water needs a more detailed understanding, right? So this water map we are able to do with the contour map, and then we go confirm it on site, see how the slopes are carrying the water, how's the erosion, where is it puddling, where does it make sense to put a pond, this really determines, where we put our buildings, so that we don't want to obstruct any of these bigger water channels, and etc. From there, we calculate our rainwater harvesting potential. whether it is on the site, the storm water, or if it's from built areas, how much water can we capture, how much can we store. Based on the use, we try and basically slow down all the water that is entering the site and infiltrate or store it based on the requirements. We do the regular elevation and slope analysis that I think everybody does to understand the slopes of the site. And last of all, we do a resource assessment, which is to see what is existing around the site that we can use. Because in permaculture, embodied energy of anything that you're trying to bring into the site needs to be as little as possible, because we want to tap into that local resilient knowledge that is already existing around that region, whether it is people's whether it's skills or if it's actual just materials. We try and do a proper assessment of it and use it in our designs. Yeah. So that's the environmental study. And after that, we go into elements. So from that, we derive the different elements that now the client wants, right? So with these elements, we do this exercise. I know it looks very confusing and very colorful, and you're like, what is this very confusing diagram? It's basically to understand the relationships between these different elements and how they are interacting with each other. So here, if you see, all of these elements have a little number next to them, which is the number of times that they are dependent or interacting with another element. The whole process of this is not exactly to get, the whole process of doing this is also just to understand in your head how these are related to each other and how maybe you can stack one on top of the other, reduce the amount of work by putting them very in like close proximity to each other. And so the highest, so the elements with the highest number of linkages will go into the lower zones. Himanshu will tell you more about our zoning and how we then take these elements and place them into zones. Yeah, over to you, Himanshu.
Thanks. Okay, I hope you can hear me. So basically the idea of zones is that it's essential for creating and optimizing beneficial functions of the land. Permaculture relies on several methods like this, and zone analysis is one of them. Simply put, think of placing the thing that you use the most close to you. Okay, like for example, zone 0 is the home, and then as the zone progresses, it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The kind of interaction also reduces, and basically your high intensity zone is in zone 0 and zone 1. As the distance increases, it becomes a low intensity zone. Also, zone 5 becomes a more self-managed system where you don't have to put in too much energy, where you don't have to think about taking care of it on an everyday basis. Zone 0 is basically where you live. Zone 1 is where you visit frequently, and zone 2, zone 3 are occasional, and then zone 5 is just wild. So I mean, it's amazing how it's simple this is, but you'll be surprised like how people generally don't think about their zones, and yeah, this is like super useful in our design. So what we do is that once we have the environmental study, and once we have the vision, once we have elements and linkages and zones, etc., we put it all on paper, and we sort of do bubble diagrams such as this, and we then talk to the client about like what they think about this, and are they okay with this, and we also take them through the reasoning behind the studies, the reasoning behind the placement of these zones. So all of this is kind of done objectively to see what this looks like. Yeah, I know it looks kind of colorful, but it also signifies where, what's happening where, and so on. So finally, we come to the design. Design for us is like sort of the easy thing to do. Usually what we learn to do in permaculture is that we don't try to jump into design at the first go. First, we tell the client that, okay, we need to do our studies first to understand what can happen where. We've had people come to us and say that, oh, I'm going to locate this pond like here, and where there's actually no water, or there's no chance of like getting water there, and it might take a lot of energy to bring the resources there. So without the understanding of the land, design can be difficult. But with all of these studies put together and layered, this becomes super easy. So this is one of our designs. So we use a lot of like colors, and we do a lot of work on paper first, and then we kind of color it digitally as we go forward. So the other thing is basically, yeah, this is one of our projects in Hyderabad. This is a project in Coorg, which is about 135 acres. So one thing about our design is also that it needs to be understood by everybody, whoever is using that landscape, not just the client. It should also be the workers and everybody who takes a look at this map. They should be able to quickly, at one glance, understand what's happening where.
Yeah. We can't see the image. Sorry.
Oh, you can't see the image?
No, I haven't seen.
Yeah, the presentation is not visible.
It's visible to me.
Oh.
Himanshu, what I would suggest is please stop sharing and reshare it, because somebody started sharing in between. So it has
okay.
been presenting. The presentation is still there. You'll have to find it within the people, and you'll have to pin it to the screen.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Can everybody see the presentation now?
I would request everybody to pin it onto the screen, please. If you hover your mouse over that, you have to pin it to the screen.
Oh, okay. It kept saying I was presenting. Okay, anyway, I'll take you through the pictures quickly again for wherever you've missed. So we're talking about the zones here. And I'm assuming you didn't see all this. Is that right? Sachin?
From the previous slides, please.
You can quickly run through it.
From the previous slides.
This one.
Still previous, yeah, right.
Okay, this one. Okay, this is where, okay. This was us explaining about zoning and stuff as it goes forward. Then how do we put our zoning on the map with the colors and everything? And we were talking a bit about the design. So this is what we're talking about. Anyway, what I was saying here was that this was the photograph that I was on, the image that I was on. So what I was saying was that we define these elements clearly in blowouts, and everybody should be able to understand the drawing. The drawing shouldn't be an intimidating one. So it should be clear. It should sort of communicate the information. And if they have any questions, they ask us. So this is a lake. We work a lot on urban common spaces and lakes and parks and so on. This is a lake in north of Bangalore called Tarahunse. So we've done the design for that as well. So everybody should be able to understand this design. One thing that we do is after the design is done, we give it to the client, and then we do an implementation guidance with them. So our interaction with the client needs to be extremely close, because permaculture is sort of new, and we want them to take ownership of their landscape. We want them to engage with us directly from the beginning to the end, so that they also have, so that they know exactly what we're trying to communicate. At the same time, they also understand the kind of hardship that it takes to work on the ground. So eventually what happens is that all the design and everything is communicated through this implementation guidance, and they're also kind of happy working with us that way. So I'll take you through some of the examples of our projects. So this is Perma Farm in Bangalore. This was about 3 acres. It was completely dry and flat, and the client wanted us to do some sort of wanted us to make this into a full-fledged permaculture farm and food forests and so on. So we started working on this, and then now it looks like this. So this is a perennial food forest mixed with annuals as well. So these are some of the pictures from this project. We also work on, like I mentioned earlier, we also work a lot on urban common spaces. So one of our rather favorite project is Jakur Lake. Jakur Lake, we've done a community food forest. When Jal Poshan, the trust that takes care of this lake, they approached us and said, can we do something here in this landscape? And this again was terrible soil. It was the dredged soil from the lake bed that was dumped here, and they wanted to do a community, some sort of a permaculture garden. So we decided, okay, let us do a community food forest where people could come and harvest the fruit and work on the garden and so on. So we slowly started working on it, and then now we have, now it's like completely green, and we have a lot of produce that comes from here as well. It's about 900 square meters, and this was, I mean, within almost less than a year or so, I think the garden just grew. So we got a lot of excess biomass from the lake, and you'd see that the lakes generate a lot of like water hyacinth and typha, and there's a lot of alligator weed and so on. So we kind of used all of that excess biomass to build soil on this on the sides of these lake beds. So now we get a lot of local perennial foods. We're also thinking of now donating all of this food to local Anganwadis to sort of get the produce also kind of goes to them, and people can, from the locals can come and work on the garden. So this is another project that we've done. This is about 100 acres, about 95 acres. This is Tamarind Valley Collective. It was completely dry. Farmers had kind of abandoned this place because they couldn't grow anything. There was no water, there's no borewell, nothing. So what we started doing was that we started doing the studies first. And this is us walking around in the nallas. Most of the time you would find us in different places on the land like this in the initial phases of the project. We're walking through the nallas, seeing where the erosion is, understanding erosion patterns, and so on. So slowly we started doing gully plugs, we started doing swales. We work on water quite intensively because water kind of works directly with generating microclimates as well. So, and with the studies and with the vegetation studies and water, we kind of combine that together. So we started slowly getting water, and we were able to harvest a lot of water and save water within the soil. And once there was no water in this place for a long time, and now once we dug the ponds and stuff, I mean, all it takes is maybe three monsoons and 2 monsoons or so, and now there's water in this land. The whole idea was to store water high up in the land. Now it looks like this. There's a lot of passive irrigation with swales and gully plugs and so on. And now the community comes. The community does an amazing job here. That's the other thing that we do. We involve the community directly in whatever we think. Otherwise, it'll just be, for people, it'll just be a ditch in the ground, you know, for clients who don't involve actively. It's like, what have you done? But once we start involving them, they take more interest in these projects. So this is what the gardens look like right now. So this is Kunjuri again. We showed you the environmental study for this project. We started doing swales and infiltration basins. This is in Hosur, again, low rainfall region. You know, one rain, and this is what happens. It's incredible the amount of water that you can store in your landscape. This is again in Hyderabad. This is called Arbor Road Estate. We dug a huge pond, and then within 2 rains, the entire thing filled up. So imagine the amount of water, amount of soil that's being eroded this time. And this is another project in BGD, in Kundapur. And you can see Kiri for scale in that, in the picture on the left. And now it's filled up with water. It's incredibly beautiful, and the entire thing is filled up with water right now. This is another project in Belgium that we've done. There was a lot of erosion that was happening in this place, and we tried to contain that erosion with a lot of gully plugs and basins. And within like 6 months or so, now we have vegetation. Vegetation always follows water. So we have vegetation, and now it looks like this. So we work a lot with the community, and we're big on knowledge sharing. Kiri will explain more in detail about this. And over to you, Kiri.
Okay, hi. Yeah, so basically, as Himanshu said, we work a lot with knowledge sharing and community building. So what we realize is that this work, even though we do it for a living, it's the kind of work that everyone should be doing, that we should be healing our land, we should be harvesting water. And the only way we can do this and build this kind of resilience is by working together and supporting each other and being open with the information that we have. And so we, through various means, we try to create community. So we, yeah, you can go to the next slide. In Jakur, for example, a community just kind of emerged here to create these gardens together on the banks of the lake. And we saw that quickly it wasn't only about gardening, but there was a lot of skill sharing. and it builds a lot of encouragement in people to see that they can actually achieve these kinds of things together. And we also share a lot of the information that we gather on projects such as this. We share on our website, and we put out whatever research and kind of information that we think is useful. We try to put it out so that anyone can access it, and anyone who has land can just call us. And we like to just as much as possible just enable people to do the kind of work that we do. And when we go to projects as well, like for example, this is in Coorg at the Pumale estate. You saw the design earlier. We really try as much as possible to find the people who are from the place, who live there, who are familiar with the land, who know the history, who can tell us stories about the land, so that then that way, whatever design we create for the place doesn't just stick out like a sore thumb, and that isn't nested then in the local ecology and in local society there. So it's very much about recognizing when it's time for us to stop talking and learn from other people, and recognizing the value of that exchange of information wherever we go. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. Now, this actually goes a little bit back more towards design. So one of the tools that permaculture offers us is these permaculture principles. Now, there are many different principles that one can follow. There are different principles that different practitioners use, but we've just highlighted some of the ones that we use. And these basically guide the design process for us. So when we have the elements and we want to think about where would they make sense on the map, where should we place, for example, the vegetable garden, where should we put the pond, we can use some of these principles to guide us in that decision making. So for example, the first one would be mimicking nature. Nature obviously is already figured out perfectly how to purify water, how to build soil. And so if we mimic natural systems, then we know that we are we're going to get success. Valuing diversity, recognizing that within the problem you have the solution, and it's just a system communicating to you. Valuing marginal, whether it's, because I won't get into that now, I think we don't have, but using small scale and intensive systems instead of spreading yourself thin and using all your energy on a large landscape, making small mistakes and then replicating from your successes. And of course, Janani also mentioned, we do resource assessments, so we use local resources as much as possible to minimize the amount of energy, and also they're just generally more appropriate. And then find places where you can make the least change for the greatest effect. So these sorts of principles basically just guide our decision making, and they apply not only to physical landscapes, but can also be used in invisible relationships. So when we're working with community and so on, some of these principles can be useful in that as well, because we've always found that it's more humans who tend to complicate things, and that nature is quite fine with looking after itself. So actually the invisible relationships tend to be very important to, have clarity in those and manage them well. Yeah. And then the last but absolutely not least, as in the definition, we said that permaculture is an ethics-based methodology. So all of our decisions are based on these three ethics. And if we compromise them, we will not create a regenerative system, and we'll create degenerative systems. And so the ethics are care for earth, care for people and self, and of course, fair share. Now, if you want to know more about the ethics and the principles, we have, you can go to our website. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. We have our journal posts. You can explore more about these different topics there. And we have one on the principles and ethics. So there's more, we go into more detail there. So thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for listening and watching our presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll take some questions now, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Himanshu, Janani, and Kiri. Sachin, would you take over the questions from the chat box if there are any?
Maithili, you can access the chat box, and
yeah,
your video is off. Can you please switch on the video?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So we have one question from Sahana Deepa. So Yeah, her question is, when you work on the sites with an existing water body, especially urban lakes, do you look at the water quality of the lake, and could you talk some about some methods you have executed to improve it?
Yeah, maybe I can answer that question. Kiri, if you want to join and just jump in and answer.
Yeah, no, you go ahead. Yeah.
So basically, so the straight answer is no. We don't directly work with the quality of water at the lake. There are other organizations that do that kind of work really well. So we work kind of indirectly to utilize the stuff that's grown because of the high nutrient value that water gets. Like, for example, your water hyacinth and all of that, like, alligator grass and all of this really grow with like high nitrates and high phosphate content in the water. So we utilize that biomass to grow the community gardens and shore planting and all of that on the lake. So in terms of the quality of water while we're working on the lake, we don't check while working, because there are like so many other people doing that work as well. Yeah, so that's the short answer for this.
Yeah, thank you. There's one more question from Mohammed Bhatia. So he definitely compliments on the well-researched project work that you have shown us. So what are the data sources for all this research, and are there any software involved to generate data and for overlaying data for the analysis?
Yeah. Yeah, go on.
No, a lot of it for different things is for the climatic data, we tend to just do online research on, finding information from weather stations and so on. We definitely also recognize that a lot of the research that we do remotely or on, not necessarily remotely, but a lot of the research that you do online, you have to validate it on site. So you might find certain patterns, but then it's always best to interview people locally to get the information that's, the historic information that they just know from their own experience. Often that's far more specific, and we realize that each land has, even within the same region, might have very different conditions, like local winds and so on. Yeah, but in terms of our data sources, we just do as much research as we can through. We have some of our favorite books, and we've been thinking that we should, put up a list of those. Oh, we actually have, don't we have, Himanshu, our list?
Yeah.
Yeah,
we have a list, yeah.
We have a list of like places where the books and stuff that we have. It's called on our maybe we'll share this on the chat. It's on our journal post. We've written something called Start Small and Start Now, where you'll find a lot of information about like where we get the data from and stuff like that. Just to add to Kiri's point as well, we encourage the client also to get a weather station. Weather station is not very expensive. Once they're working on their landscape, it's also useful for them to get that weather station so that they can also share the data to the other local farms and farmers and to designers who are working on this landscape. So a lot of it is that, and we also do a lot of interviews. There's a lot of questions that we ask the client. We ask a lot of questions. We also walk around a lot around the landscape. We talk to the locals. So a lot of information is sourced from the locals through interviews and so on. So and yes, most of it comes from the web and interviews and the client and weather stations if available.
Okay, that sounds like a very extensive work before even you get onto the project.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Sushmita. She's keen on knowing where you could get the biomass to create the soil in one of your projects that you showed us. I think she's referring to the Jakur Lake, maybe.
Yeah. So of course, because we're relying as much as possible on on producing the resources we need on site, we don't necessarily want to bring in manure and compost from far away. So what we do is, for Jakkur, for example, in the beginning, we were, we used a lot of water hyacinths and things that was brought from the lake itself. The fishermen brought it from on boat, and we built that up. But we also use a lot of fast-growing biomass plants. So we use Napier grass, we use Mexican sunflower, Gliricidia, different kinds of nitrogen-fixing species, especially ones that really need very little and grow very quickly and are comfortable with being chopped and dropped. And so a lot of our biomass on our projects, for example, will create living fences and windbreaks, and we'll use that as the initial bank of biomass to use to build soil on the project. So actually, growing biomass is one of the foundational parts of any project that we start and any project that we do. Yeah. Yeah. Because, yeah.
Okay. So we have another question from Syed. Do you have you been able to monitor carbon levels before and after your projects to see the impact? So how big is the impact on the carbon footprint?
No, but come and do it for us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we have not done any carbon monitoring of the carbon, but it's just that, I mean, as you can see from pictures, the transformation is like it's visual, you know. So a lot of things which were not growing earlier would start growing. So a lot of our collection, this kind of data is indirect and it's also visual. So, and also the soil quality has improved tremendously in around those areas, and at the same time the microclimates have also improved. So we have never gotten to test the carbon in the soil before and after. So yeah, I mean, if you're keen on it, let's do it.
Yeah, if somebody knows to do that, please help us out.
Yeah.
Because generally also, a lot of it is just it's very apparent what needs to be done, and also as the changes begin to happen. But we would like to do more in-depth studies to get these parameters down, just for to get the numbers to prove it, because everyone likes numbers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have another question from Prerna. Can you explain the curves in the sector and flows diagram that you showed in the presentation?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So sectors are when something is entering the site from a larger, section of the portion of the site. So for example, winds. If we have southwest monsoon winds, so then you draw an arc from between the south and the west, saying these winds are coming from here. Flows are something that generally have an exit and entry point. So if it's water, if it's human movement, cattle, animals, all of that can become a flow. So when you have all of these things mapped out with these arcs and these arrows, when you're say you're putting your house in the client likes this view and they want the house there, but then your fire sector is exactly right there. So now that helps you build a fire break or try to convince them saying, no, that is a bit dangerous, all your, this is the wild zone, or, what you're able to justify saying this is very close to the fire sector. And you can also benefit from it in terms of like using the wind for passive cooling, putting your pond in a place where, the wind is carrying in that cool air and it's, your house is facing that. So in a lot of ways, you're able to manage all of these energies that are flowing in and out of your site. And for the solar arc, there's a website called suncalc.org, where you can put in your GPS and it will show you the path of the sun during the summer, when it tends to be on the northern hemisphere, and then in the southern hemisphere during the winters. So that also helps you plan on where you want your entrance, your room facing, which direction, avoid the summer heat, but all of those things that you can plan.
Thank you. So we have a question from Monica. What is your take on sustainable design versus regenerative design?
That's a bit of a tricky one to answer because everyone seems to have their own definitions often of the word of sustainable and regenerative. One thing, but the thing about regenerative design, the one thing that's important to us is just about really thinking as much as possible about how we're creating an ecosystem and how we're going to create an ecosystem that we can live in, but how is everything cycling back into itself? And sometimes you see design that might consider certain things and therefore be considered green, you know, because, for example, it's using something that, you know, is slightly less energy intensive, or but sometimes when you add all of those things together, you realize that actually there's a very high embodied energy to that structure or that design. And so it's hard to say because it depends on each practitioner and what it is that they consider to be sustainable. But as far as we've seen, a lot of things that are called sustainable are just about kind of carrying on in a certain way and just doing a little less damage. But what we're really aiming for is how can we heal the damage that's been done and then go one step further to create something that's extremely abundant and provides for itself and is resilient in that way, where eventually it doesn't even need any of us to do anything for it anymore. So, you know,
Just to add to Kiri's point, basically regenerative design is also, like she mentioned, we're benefiting the ecosystem in a positive way, you know. So we're not just creating systems for humans, but we're also including the fauna, the flora, and everybody else who's dependent on the ecosystem is benefited by it. So we kind of think positively in terms of regenerative design. Just to give an example, it's like you may be using your recycled water to water your lawn. Regenerative design questions, do you even need a lawn in the first place? You know, it's like, can that system take care of itself? So how many systems can function by themselves so that eventually, like you mentioned, can it take care of its, can it, you know, survive by itself? So eventually your work is, you become a super lazy person. Your work is very minimal. You don't have to do much because you've sort of thought about it regeneratively. So sustainable design is just a cycle. It just goes on.
All right. We have a lot of questions flowing in, but we have another 8 minutes. Maybe we can attempt 2 more of them, or we can take 2 more of them. Do you monitor the water quality of food in the water bodies that you create, and how?
So the straight answer is we have not done it yet. We've not monitored the water quality. Again, like this kind of goes back to the earlier question. A lot of it is visual, and you know, you can see the water quality. When we talk about the water quality itself, the first thing that we do is through our environmental studies, the kind of studies that we do, thorough studies that we do in terms of, so we understand what is the kind of water that's coming in, what is the quality of the water that's coming in, what happens to the rainwater, and so on. So we are very well aware of the inputs to the system. So in that way, we're kind of confident that, okay, you know, the water quality is okay. But on the other hand, if we feel like, okay, or if we know that there's a chemical input into that water, and if there are like heavy metals coming into that water, then we take necessary precautions to ensure, and we know that we're not going to grow edibles because there's a chemical input in that system. But so far that has not happened. Most of the lakes and the water bodies that we work on, the water bodies are on farms, so the water is fairly, you know, we're certain that the quality is good for growing food. But you know, for lakes, we do a thorough study and research in terms of understanding what kind of quality it is.
Okay, and maybe we can pick one more. Do you work closely with architects for projects like residences for self-sustaining living? Do you think a deeper understanding is necessary at architectural design level as well?
Yes, the quick answer is yes. We work very closely with architects. We work with Biome. We actually work with a bunch of architects, and the thing is, we also when we do our zoning, we also give them the feedback as to where to place the building. We don't get involved in the interior, the design of the building itself, but we involve ourselves in how is it responding to the architecture outside, so we don't design landscape and separately from the design of the building itself. How is the gray water interacting with the kitchen, and where is the kitchen placed, and what should be the should there be banana circles, or should there be a kitchen garden close by? It's like all these things we work closely with them to understand how our design is also responsive to the architecture.
I think also for the most part, we've been quite lucky to work with architects who are quite ecologically conscious. But certainly, definitely, there have been cases where it's obvious that there needs to be more of this kind of whole systems thinking within architecture. There are many examples even now where, rainwater harvesting is an afterthought. And a lot of this stuff is kind of considered like some sort of niche thing that isn't really relevant to, just conventional, if someone wants a house, it's not really relevant, but then there's like this, it becomes like an afterthought. Yeah. And the problem with that is like I've been part of a project where then things end up having to be literally, you have to retrofit, yeah. And it's so much more expensive. It's so much more effort. And if a lot of this knowledge was just in place right from the beginning, I don't know, I'm not an architect, so I don't know what is taught in architecture colleges. But if a lot of this information was already instilled in the beginning, then it would mean that a lot of work would be saved later, because you wouldn't be retrofitting and trying to fit in things into a house that's very fixed, So, yeah, but luckily for the most part, we've found that there are a lot of architects who are also very aware.
They kind of come with the landscape first without the building to see how best we can integrate our landscape around the building. The built environment is kind of the systems, the ecological studies kind of govern the placement that goes on in terms of the elements that go onto the ground. So in that way, we've been kind of lucky working with like really good people that way.
Yeah, we always are really happy when when people contact us and the house hasn't been placed yet, hasn't been built yet. Yeah. And so then because we're working with the land, so then it makes so then we can easily then fit everything around. Well, if the house is already there, then it's much harder. Yeah, usually it's much harder. Yeah. Or more work. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Definitely, I think like-minded people need to be together when such work has to be executed. So I think we can stop taking the questions and close the session here.
Okay.
Formally thanking the team of Ananas and taking out time, especially, and showing your projects and your work to us. We had good response, definitely, and
thank you.
We look forward for more collaboration in future, definitely, and all the best to you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And just to say, if anyone has any questions that they would still like us to answer, they can get in touch with us on Instagram or Facebook, and also take a look at our website. And we're always happy to, we have phone numbers up on the website. You can just get in touch. Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Because we have a lot of questions here we couldn't take up because of the time constraint. But
actually, maybe if they can be directed to our Instagram or something, we're more than happy to answer all of them.
Yeah, we'll try doing that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All the participants who have spent their 1 hour precious evening with us.
Really. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maithili and Sachin.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.